Welcome to the Concordia Publishing House podcast, where we consider everything in the light of Jesus Christ, who is the same yesterday, today, and forever. I'm your host, Elizabeth Pittman. Will people meet Jesus in us if we aggressively respond in kind to the threats we feel in the world around us? Or are these people more likely to meet Jesus in us if we patiently endure the challenges that have been set before us, constantly relying on Christ? In his new book, How the Light Shines Through, author Chad Lakies helps us in this task by first acknowledging our reality and how the church has reacted to it thus far. Then he helps us to imagine better ways that we can interact with the world around us, ways that will help the light shine through and reflect the life-changing love of Jesus to our neighbors. Before we start a conversation with Chad, I'd like to thank our friends at the LCMS Foundation for their support of the podcast. Imagine a future where your God-given gifts continue to benefit your family and faith after you're called home to heaven. The LCMS Foundation can help you create a gift plan so that your assets, things like retirement accounts, home, or land, will leave a lasting impact on the people you love and the ministries you care about most. Learn more about creating your gift plan at lcmsfoundation.org. We'd also like to welcome our friends from Concordia University, Wisconsin. Thank them for their support of the podcast. No matter where you are in life, Concordia's online continuing education classes fit your schedule and connect you with a supportive community. CUW offers flexible opportunities to deepen your Bible knowledge, explore church history, and enhance your ministry skills. Invest in your personal and spiritual growth by visiting cuw.edu/continuinged to view the full course list and sign up today. Thanks to the Foundation and to Concordia University, Wisconsin Continuing Ed. And now on to our conversation with Chad Lakies. Chad, welcome to the podcast.
Hey, thanks, Elizabeth. Super happy to be here and excited about it.
No, I'm glad to have you here. I have heard you speak, and I know you've been speaking on the topic of this new book for quite a while now. The new book being How the Light Shines Through, Resilient Witness in Dark Times. Tell us a little bit about what led you down the path of writing and speaking and researching on this topic.
Yeah, so this goes back probably at least 10 years to my service at Concordia University in Portland. Being where we were in a very secular area of the country, very religiously diverse. Our campus was that way. Also a very socially liberal or progressive part of the country where we're trying to be, a conservative, faithfully Christian, refuge or bastion or outpost or however you want to describe it. People would think of it differently. It was interesting to navigate that intersection there, and so we had a few challenges with some students that wanted to, try to push boundaries and ask us to think in different ways and to kind of join up with what seemed to be, the culturally orthodox way of doing things, and that being kind of the progressive ideas that were really taking hold out in that part of the country, and then eventually kind of taking over everywhere. We were on the cutting edge of that. It was just happening in college campuses first. So as I tried to wrestle through that and figure out what does a faithful witness look like without it being a kind of zero-sum game, either they win or we win, and the other people walk away with their heads hanging in shame. We didn't want to treat students that way, but we wanted to kind of have the ability to give a nice winsome witness. So we just struggling through that is really where it started. And then from that learning, I've been talking to people about it for quite a long time. Before I left the university, and then as I've come to Lutheran Hour Ministries, and we're now, really just trying to help people figure out how to gain a hearing for the gospel. And so with a lot of the tools that we have that are research-based, they really start with having a conversation about faith. But a lot of people were wondering about, well, how do you even have a conversation at all when we've got all of this tension and so much antagonism back and forth? And so I thought, well, maybe I can kind of help lead into some of the really great resources that we have at LHM by sharing some of what I've learned. I just continue to be a nerd about this intersection of church and culture, always reading. And there's a great line that David Brooks has. I like to quote him. He's a really easy read. He's a New York Times columnist. But he says about his own writing and I think he stole this from a Christian because it sounds very Christian, but he says, I'm just a beggar leading other beggars to where I've found bread. And you're shaking your head like maybe you've heard this before. It's got to be, he cribbed it from somewhere. And I think he says he did. But anyhow, I just feel the same. You know, I'm trying to give away tools that I think are helpful to the church. And maybe they don't have to read everything, but the little bits and pieces that I've put into the book here to help lead people along this way, that's what I really want to do, just be helpful.
As I've been reading through the manuscript, I found myself like highlighting and grabbing a lot of different quotes because it is when it's very readable, but it's very rich in the content. But it's again, it's a very accessible read, and so I found that I was quickly grabbing quotes and sending them to friends and colleagues across the floor here, saying, "Hey, check this out. He's spot on right here." So it's really, I love it when we get a book like that that you're like, "Yes, we need this. This is really." A good message for us. So I hope our listeners will be encouraged to pick it up. One of the things that we talk about is, we hear it all the time of, oh, to be a Christian in the secular age, in our world today, in the culture, it's so dark and oppressive. Give us a baseline of what we're really talking about. What does it really mean to, quote, live in a secular age?
Yeah, I think the most basic way to do it is to compare our time to Luther's time. So in Luther's day, roughly 500 years ago, um, what we would call atheism or unbelief, in the most basic sense that we're familiar with it now, did not exist. It was not even really an option. And in the 500 years between his time and our time, not only has it become something that did exist, but in our time especially, it's a live option. Probably all of us know non-believers, and that's the stark contrast. And so I borrow the idea of a secular age from Charles Taylor, the Catholic philosopher. His book A Secular Age is really dense and challenging, but it's been so critically acclaimed that people think it might still be being read in the 22nd century. So with a set of ideas that's that important, I think we as the church should sit up and pay attention. And I'm just trying to grab a few ideas out of there that are helpful. So what do we do then if we live in a time when belief of any sort is contestable and therefore contested? That's another way of thinking about what it means to live in a secular age. Or, as I talk about it in the book, we live in an age of implausibility. That it's just difficult to believe in a Christian way when there are all of these different competing views in our highly pluralistic culture. I use pluralistic in the sense as just meaning manyness, right? It's empirically true. Um, and so navigating that is really what I'm trying to help us get after, right? I think a lot of the problems that I address and some of the practical solutions I then deal with emerge out of this background when belief is really difficult, it's contestable and contested. People have doubts that they are probably very shy about expressing, and I would say even Christian leaders, right? Strong, prominent people, leaders of flocks, shepherds of congregations, institutional leaders, seminary professors potentially, right? What Taylor's talking about is that the kinds of doubt and questioning that are present in our time are kind of these haunting things that pick at us at times, and at other times we feel maybe quite confident. But it's usually through relationships when I'm exposed to somebody who believes very much otherwise, but I share a ton of other things in common. We love the same writers, books, sports teams, music. We work together, our kids hang out together, and so on. Then the question can creep in, well, why my way and not hers or his? And the older way of really trying to deal with that was just, well, belief is merely propositional. Let's just hammer it with apologetics that make Christianity make logical sense, intellectual sense. But that isn't what this encounter with somebody else's beliefs is actually. That's not where it's hitting us. It's not hitting us here in our heady cognitive space. It's hitting us here in our emotional affective space. And that's something that apologetics and the the usual sense doesn't really speak to. And so, with that kind of gap of how to answer and deal with that, we've all got to just wrestle through what it means to live amongst people who are different than us, and still find a way to kind of remain faithful. And then, as these differences are just um, elevated and exacerbated in our really polarized, fragmented, splintered age, and thinking about those fractures along particular lines, like religious difference, for example, um, navigating that then can become just really challenging. And so some of the chapters that I talk to those issues, how do we get along with people who are vastly different than us, but might have some things in common, but when we come to the most sacred of our convictions, we find out they're different. How do we not just how do we stop from disassociating with them, right? How do we stop that knee-jerk reaction? That's just one of the things I'm trying to deal with.
Well, I was going to say, we're in this age where, you're talking about doubt and the implausibility, and everybody's talking about authentic. Be your authentic self. You know,
Yeah.
that's not really like, if you're gonna be your authentic self and I'm gonna be my authentic self, those two things are probably going to clash at some point. And where's the baseline? How do we navigate that in this world where we're hearing that so much?
Yeah. I try to deal with that in one of the chapters in particular. I think the challenge is exactly the way that you put it, right? My way versus your way. And what really is lacking is a baseline, right? Some kind of arbiter that's going to decide who gets to have their way and who doesn't. Right now, the cultural orthodoxy basically is something like it's forbidden to forbid, right? I can't step in the way of what you want and think is best for yourself, and you can't step in the way of what I want and think is best for myself. And so here we are at those loggerheads that you're talking about. I think the challenge with authenticity is we don't often think about it as an evaluative term. And when it's used in an evaluative way, that it's got to be against a background, right? So thinking about, for example, the Secret Service, they're often trained to detect counterfeit dollars by studying the real thing all the time, all the time, all the time. That's their background. So when they see something that isn't the real thing, it's going to stand out kind of like a sore thumb in a way. We need a background for ourselves to understand what it means to be truly authentic. So that's where I bring in, for example, I think, Luther's doctrine of vocation is just one of the most helpful things that we have to offer as the church. It's a way of people to be seeing themselves potentially entering into this grand story of God being the creator of everything, including them, of sin and redemption, of Jesus and our life here in the mundane and the ordinary. But it's a background story against which we can evaluate our lives, that we can be confident in because it comes to us authoritatively, versus the way of thinking about authenticity that seems to be so popular, which is, follow your heart, march to the beat of your own drummer, you do you, those sorts of mantras and ways that we even unintentionally encourage each other, that are really wrong-headed. Because if I'm going to follow my heart, trust my feelings, I've also got to recognize that sometimes I'm very often misled by them. Not, I guess not sometimes, but very often. I'm hungry, I'm stressed, I'm lacking sleep, I'm ill, right? Or I'm just straight up mad about something. My day fell apart, all the plans that I had, right? All those sorts of things become invasive. Those feelings prevent us from thinking really clearly, and I'm not sure that my heart's trustworthy. Scripture speaks to that. The Christian tradition speaks to that. St. Augustine, Alexander Solzhenitsyn, and so many others. So I bring in a few of those examples to try to guide people through it, and then really anchor ourselves in evaluating, who am I authentically? Well, I've got to look outside myself for the story to understand that. And it's really the Christian story that gives us the answer.
You mentioned that, we often can fall into the trap of discounting all the areas that we have in common with people in favor of latching onto the differences and letting that dominate. I don't want to get terribly contentious here, but we're in the time of the world where we have a political election coming up, and you're seeing these conversations happening, and disagreements among friends and family members and congregation members may be happening. Can you share some tips on how we can, position ourselves to concentrate on those things that we do have in common so that we can preserve those relationships?
Yeah, I think one of the things that's helpful to recognize is something I've been hearing from Yuval Levin, who's another guy that I quote a number of times in the book. He's just a brilliant political scientist. He's a Jewish thinker, so he's got a lot, say, theologically in common with us, at least in terms of, roots and foundations of how Christianity and Judaism are related, and he's highly respected by a lot of Christians. One of the things he's been talking about lately in terms of these divisions is how we kind of characterize our differences, and in a political season in particular, what's happening with the two sides is basically most most of their discourse publicly is just a promise to not let the other side win. Right, we're just that's all we're for. Well, that's really kind of empty and lacking. When you start to think about it, where are you going to take us? What is your plan? How are you going to maybe build cohesion, build some solidarity, bring us back together again? The research shows that we hate how fractured and divided we are, but a lot of us don't know what to do about it. It's frustrating, it's exhausting. So, from that kind of perspective, how do we think about focusing on sameness? I think another really helpful thinker is John Anazu, who is a legal scholar here in the St. Louis area. He talks about the fact that despite the way that we've elevated some of these significant differences, political being just one of them, that we all have a kind of modest unity that we don't really recognize, but we just take for granted. And he's trying to bring it to our level of attention, right? All of us want good education. All of us want opportunity and access to good health care, good social infrastructure like clean water and good roads and so on and so forth. And then from there, once we realize, well, okay, that's a civic foundation that we share. What else might we share? Well, I'm a fan of the Detroit Lions, and I really hope they do well this year. I'm a fan of the University of Michigan Wolverines. That's my alma mater, right? So that's a place to go. Sports is a something that unites people in huge ways. And yes, there can be these trivial, hatreds, but if we stop to think about it, they're not really deeply meaningful, right? There are no reason to cut off a relationship. Similarly, with any sort of media and arts that we like, favorite authors, video games, um, TV shows, movies, and so on. There are so many ways that we can share life in terms of just common interests, but then paying attention to what our kids are doing and or what's going on in life otherwise. There are a lot of common experiences that we can use to come together. In the book, I really try to focus again theologically on something that's simple but overlooked, and that's the image of God that all of us are created with. That I think should be the overarching category that we use to define who we are, and then any difference is always subordinated to that. Uh, we could talk similarly. I didn't do it in the book, but we could talk similarly about the fact that Jesus shed his blood for everyone, right? This is an objective truth. Now, of course, faith has to be worked in people subjectively to grasp that gift that God offers. But you know, God has done this for all people, and He wants all to come to a knowledge of Him and to be saved. So we've got really good starting places as Christians that help us set aside the emphasis on difference and open us up to concentrating just a little more on the things we do have in common. They're really the ways to carry on a relationship. We don't have to agree with everyone about everything in order to remain friends.
I think one way that this book could be summarized is to say that our reactions matter for our witness, and you spend a lot of time exploring how we can react differently to the situations we find ourselves in to better witness to those around us. And I think you have a number of quotes that I pulled out about basically, and I'm paraphrasing here, but people are watching, and our actions are speaking quite loudly. What tips or reminders would you offer to kind of help us when we get into those situations that might be difficult to temper our reactions when emotions may be high?
Yeah. Again, I lean back on other people and their wisdom. I like David Brooks's newest book. What is it called? It is on my shelf. Yeah, How to Know a Person. How to Know a Person. It's great. And one of the things he talks about in that book is a, a, a feature of our behavior that happens in a relationship sometimes where, say, somebody will be telling a story. And it could be about something good that happened to them or something bad that happened to them. And our God-given gifts of empathy start to do their work, and we can relate to their story because we've got something that in some way is similar. But we start to tell that story in a way that inadvertently or unintentionally means to kind of top their story, and it effectively diminishes them as a person, right? Like, my story is better than you. Well, all we're looking for is a kind of, attention, affirmation, a way to connect, but we don't always realize that we're doing that. And so I've been trying anyhow to when I start to feel that impulse. I mean, this is something that's really stuck with me from Brooks, something convicting. Um, to stop myself from doing that, to just listen and hear their story, and maybe ask some questions, right? To just dig deeper into who they are, what their experience has been, what it's been like, how they've come to the conclusions that they have about life and the world, rather than to either push back, be an antagonist, try to challenge them, try to undercut them, or as Brooks would say, to be a diminisher. I would much rather try to be a person who is, you know, elevating somebody else, right? Helping them to feel maybe a little more seen, a little more affirmed. Not in the liberal progressive way, but I think just in a general Christian love sort of way, right? I think a lot of the liberal progressive ideas are Christian ones that have been stolen and co-opted into, a very secular way of being. So there's a lot of roots that we have there. But we don't notice that it's happening that way. And I don't know, that's at least one tip, right? Try not to be a diminisher. Listen more. Try to be someone who elevates other people just by being an open ear.
Well, and to be curious about
Yeah.
what the person you're speaking to is experiencing and ask those questions, and just the attention does not always need to be inward. We can look outward at our friends and our neighbors and chat with them. You have in this spirit, you have a really practical section in the book where you're talking about how we can avoid mistakes that might prevent engagement. And it's a really cool section where you go through a number of these different things, like the examples of love does not equal affirmation. Scrolling through to some disagreement does not equal hate, and there are others.
Sure.
Um, let's start with disagreement does not equal hate, because I mean, we've kind of gone down that path a little bit, and I think we see that so much in our world today. Talk about how we can catch ourselves when we're in situations like this.
Yeah, I think this chapter often is one where we've got to be a little bit self-reflective, especially on the disagreement it doesn't equal hate thing, because we've moved into a time culturally, socially, where to be a victim is a place of honor now, right? It's as if honor shame culture from the past or from other places that we encountered in the world has been reversed in our time. You've seen it in the Me Too movement, which is a really important movement, elevating the voice of women and some really negative experiences that they've had. That is a way that victims have taken on a place of honor, but that 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 victimhood as honor has been also co-opted into pretty much any claims to victimhood, right? Where we encounter, for example, someone disagreeing with us, we take it really personally, we call them a hater, and that is our way of kind of fighting back. There are all kinds of other ways of taking disagreement. I think we've all experienced when disagreement about who we are or what we want to do, what we believe in, what we care about has come at us, and we've been affected by it, but it's always been backed up by really good intentions, right? So we've always had our parents or our guardians around to tell us no when we're trying to do something that's going to be dangerous for us, or that's probably just a stupid decision, and we need to be redirected and guided, right? That's disagreement, but it's not coming from a place of hate. It's coming from a place of love. And I think if we can empathize with that earlier experience that we had in life, right, where this is difficult. I don't like it when somebody disagrees with me. It doesn't feel good. Well, but it isn't all about my feelings, and life isn't all about, birthday cakes and rainbows. It's challenging sometimes. And I think it's one of the ways that God helps us to learn to be more wise and better when he surrounds us with people who see differently, but see more clearly, because he's taught them in a way that I haven't yet experienced. I could perhaps learn something from them. Their disagreement could lead in a much more positive direction than just, all of these negative feelings and claims that I could make to being a victim of someone's violent hatred. I think that's just going too far. And as Christians, we we've got to be careful about when we can interpret things going that way. I think it's really challenging for us to not fall into that cultural habit. It's pretty knee jerk.
Mm-hmm. Talk a little bit about section of love does not equal affirmation.
Yeah, this was a place where I was really trying to think about the pressure that Christians feel, um, because I think I think there's just enough leftover understanding of what Christianity is about that the wider society knows that we're supposed to be people who love others, right? God is love. We're supposed to be people who love others. Um, Jesus, as a person, as a figure, is still held, highly, in terms of respect, because he's that kind of a person. But love in our time, I think, has come to be equivalent with a kind of affirmation. If we go back to that earlier comment where we were talking, about authenticity and that it's forbidden to forbid, right? Well, the option that you have, if it's forbidden to forbid, is only to affirm everything about everyone that they ask you to affirm. But that's not what love is, right? I think love also brings about disagreement. Love also brings about, redirecting a person. Love brings about, opportunities in relationships of trust to call into question, what people might think we should affirm. At the same time, I sometimes hear Christians talk about, s- speaking the truth in love, that phrase that comes from Ephesians 4. And it's often, so often, pulled out of context, right? You've got to read all of the preceding, 15 or so verses, maybe 13 or so. I don't remember exactly where it is, but, to understand the context of, speaking the truth in love, because I think so many Christians are ready, very ready to disagree, as if it's our job to preach the law to somebody and make sure they know that they're out of alignment with God's way and what he believes is best for them. And our code for that then is, well, I'm just speaking the truth in love. Am I not doing a good thing? Well, I don't know that we should go from the love doesn't equal affirmation claim that I make in the book all the way to this other direction of, well, all right, I'm free to hammer on them when I disagree. It just means, look, you're free not to have to go along with what they're almost pressuring you and maybe even demanding that you go along with. When I talk about the cultural orthodoxy, many of these progressive ideas where, I need to affirm someone who is expressing gender in a way that's different than we talk about in terms of Christian theology in light of the scriptures and our confessions. There's a certain kind of pressure we all feel to say the right thing, or how do I go about using a person's pronouns, right? There's a kind of pressure for that. It was part of the sign in for this app that you and I are using to record this right now. It was an option. Did I want to put in my pronouns? No, right? There's not pressure to affirm in that way. I think we're free and released from that. But at the same time, we've got to be really conscientious about how we engage, what I like to double down on is caring about the relationship first. If I disagree, fine, but I want to maintain the relationship 100% without question. So how I disagree is really going to matter, right? Um, and that takes a lot of discernment. People have asked me, for example, what do you do when it comes to pronouns? And I'm like, I don't know what the right answer is. Sometimes it's just don't use them, but address them with their actual name. Maybe it's use them because this is how they understand themselves now in order to maintain the relationship. Because if they eventually kind of work their way through this confusion with the help of God, well, then I'm still there when they've kind of got to pick up the pieces from this mess that they find themselves in. Right? I don't know what the right answer is, but it's a really challenging thing to discern your way through. What I think is the wrong answer is the knee-jerk reactions that are so common.
Well, I
Um,
think there's the key there that this all builds on is that we want to preserve the relationship. And I mean, we're assuming that we're in a position to want to preserve the relationship. And I would imagine there may be people who don't want to do that, and that sets up another whole host of problems. But
right.
as Christians, we should want to preserve that relationship and do what we can to be, um, caring and engaging and faithful witnesses.
Yeah, I think that's part of our calling. God has decided to use all of us to introduce other people to Jesus. And in an age where it's difficult to believe, well, if I say that I'm a Christian and someone is watching my life, it's going to be my living witness that begins to make following Jesus plausible for them far more strongly than any sort of argumentation that we might get in terms of apologetics or propositional theology. Sure, all of that makes sense, but I think it's a ex post facto, right? I I become a follower of Jesus through the work of the Holy Spirit. Faith is generated in me, and then my worldview begins to shift. Right, conversion is, I think, a more a process than a one moment kind of thing. And that's when the intellectual side of things comes into play. You start to make sense of this new way of life that you're now a part of, and adopting and adapting your thinking to it. But the more important thing is my witness. Can they trust me? Right? Do I live this out consistently and faithfully, or do I just pay lip service to the right things to say or the right things to believe? Am I just performing for the other Christians around me, or is this really real? Right? People are watching that and they can tell. They can tell, right? Am I trying to sell you a bill of goods? Right? Am I trying to just convince you in order to check a box for myself? Or do I really care about your eternal destiny? Do I want you there with me and the cloud of saints? Right? They can tell, and so it behooves us as best we can, and we're not always going to be great at it, but it behooves us as best we can to be mindful of that, so that our witness is winsome. This is how the early church grew. It was based on their reputation. And so I throw a little bit of that into these last chapters, right? We can draw on some of the wisdom from them
Well,
about patience.
absolutely. And I think there you have several other pieces in this section. Let's pick one more to go through quickly.
Okay.
Engagement does not equal endorsement.
Oh, okay. Yeah, great. So I come from an academic background. I used to be a university professor, and one of our policies at the university was a policy of academic freedom, right? That ideas of all sorts were free game and could be explored, because a university is a place that is searching for the truth. And a Christian university is probably the paragon example of that sort of pursuit. But that means we're going to be talking about and exploring and engaging with ideas that are antagonistic in certain ways, or at least not something that we as Christians would agree with. Right? They're antagonistic to the faith very directly, or they're just not something that we're going to agree with. But exploring them, I think, engaging with them doesn't equal some sort of tacit, underhanded endorsement of them. And so I think we have a lot of opportunity to engage across a whole bunch of different kinds of lines, right? I try to read widely. I don't agree with everyone that I read, but God still uses non-believers to give me wisdom. Um, I think we need to be open to that possibility of exploring ideas and working our way through things, exposing ourselves to things that are outside of, kind of the lines and boundaries of our confessional faith, in order to know what other people think and why they think it. Because if I don't get to know them that way, then I'm not sure how I might be a positive witness that can speak in a way to them that makes what I believe and care about and hold most sacred and dear plausible, believable, right? And I need to be able to relate on that level. And so we see the early church doing that a ton. We've got that line, I think it's from Augustine, the plundering of the Egyptians, right? Taking all of their wisdom, but not necessarily all of their deepest beliefs and confessions. We see the early Christian apologists doing this with Greek thought, and on, all through the Christian tradition up until today. This isn't something that we have to be afraid of. And I think that category mistake is just, built on fear, right? I think people are afraid of being seen as looking at or reading or thinking about or talking about ideas, and then being judged as somehow an outsider or bad or something like that. But no, God is not insecure, and I don't think that we have to be either. We can explore these ideas without fear of being accused of endorsing them.
Well, and if you come across somebody who is reading something, if we put ourselves in the position of not being quick to judge and going back to what we said earlier, ask the question, be curious, we can learn from that. It opens up a whole new conversation where we're collecting information, but we're also doing it in a way that allows us to relate to someone and protecting that relationship.
Absolutely, for sure.
So as we start to wrap up, leave us with 3 goals for a resilient church. You talk about this near the end of the book. What are 3 goals that we should be looking for?
Yeah, I think patience is a big deal. Um, we're frustrated by living in a secular age. We feel like all of our efforts to do ministry and to reach people and engage with people is often turning out to be a spinning of our wheels. There doesn't seem to be a lot of urgency for witness. And our churches seem to be in decline and not growing. And I try to account for that, but the frustration that comes up, it's making a lot of people want to bail out of ministry. It's making a lot of people not want to care about their personal witness as a layperson, and so I think just patience. Um, None of us are in charge of who's converted, who comes to believe. That's the work of the Holy Spirit. We're just called to patiently live out this witness in our everyday life. Um, I think I think being people who are patient also means that we're going to be more willing to forgive. When we encounter people who believe differently than us, it's a knee-jerk reaction to disassociate, to think of them as evil or bad or going to hell or however we want to put it. But I think opening a space or leaving a space open for the possibility of their redemption is really important. We've got to remember that we were at some point along the way enemies of God ourselves, and we're no longer enemies of God. Jesus never let an issue prevent a relationship, and if he would have, it would have started with you and me, right? We've got all the reasons of the world for him to not want a relationship with us as fallen, sinful people. But if we're in that same bucket of people who have been redeemed and Christ shed his blood for all, then the possibility of forgiveness and redemption for other people we disagree with is just a posture I think we have to have and to maintain. And I can't remember the 3 civic virtues off the top of my head at the end of this conversation, so I think I'm just going to leave it with those 2, because I think they're pretty critical and they're repeated throughout the book in certain ways.
No, I think they're absolutely right. Um, for our listeners, I would encourage you to go to the show notes. We'll have a link to the new book, How the Light Shines Through, Resilient Witness in Dark Times. Chad, thanks for joining us. Thanks for the work that you've put into this book and the speaking that you've done. For our listeners, if you ever get a chance to hear Chad speak in person, I encourage you to do it. It'll be standing room only. So we appreciate you being with us today.
Elizabeth, thanks very much. It's my pleasure.
Thanks, everyone. We'll see you next time. Thank you for joining us on this episode of the Concordia Publishing House podcast. I pray that this time was valuable to your walk with Christ. We'd love to connect with listeners on Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter at Concordia Pub. Visit cph.org for more resources to grow deeper in the gospel.